Hello and welcome to Beyond the Paradigm. My guest today is Ed Mabrie. Ed is a researcher who has his own blog at faithbyreason.net website and also his own podcast, Faith by Reason. Today, Ed and I discuss the popular theory of Satan's little season, and we seek to analyze whether or not this is a repackaged heresy spawned by the Jesuits. Well, for the first time, Ed Mabrie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate you having me. Honor and a
It's
privilege.
It's a pleasure to have you on. And as I usually do with a first time guest, and you'll be familiar with how this goes, I'd just like people to tell us a little bit about themselves and then tell us why, well, what got you into sort of the areas that you're looking at now, and because you've got your own website and you do videos. So tell us about that.
Sure. So my name's Ed Mabrie. My website, which is the best place to find me, get information about what I'm doing, is faithbyreason.net, not .com. That's a different website, but .net. And I've been doing this for wow, well over 10 years now. And so a little bit about myself. I have been a Christian most of my life. I was essentially raised in the church. My father is a minister. My grandmother was the matriarch of our church. And but I've always had a very inquisitive mind. I've always asked why about everything. Because I just need to know. And I would do that a lot in church. I believed in God and Jesus and everything, but I would ask, why? Why did he flood the earth? Why was he born of a virgin? Why X, Y, and Z happened in the book of Revelation, which is probably one of my favorite book in the Bible. A lot of strange things happening there. And I would ask a lot of whys. And I think I started to annoy this church leadership, and they just told me, you know what? It's not right to question God. I was like, okay, well, I don't want to make God mad, so I'll stop questioning him. So I basically went through my childhood, adolescence, all into college, never really questioning my faith, just accepting it. Then I go to university, and I basically run into a lot of hostility. I run into professors and even my fellow students who took great pleasure in deconstructing my beliefs and telling me that I was wrong about the Bible, that the Bible is not accurate, it's historically inaccurate, that the God of the Bible is nothing more than an ancient Canaanite vengeance deity who the ancient Israelites adopted as their own, and Jesus, either he didn't exist or he wasn't who he said he was. And again, since I had never questioned my faith, I had no defense. I did not know apologetics, and it pretty much put me in a bad position. It made me doubt a lot of things. I still believed in God, but I started to question what I was taught about him. That took me on a journey. Being a person who's analytical in their mindset, who has a scientific mindset, I I wanted my faith to make sense. And I went on a journey, and in that journey, my prayer to God was, if you are who you say you are, if you are real, then you should make sense logically, reasonably, because you would have created the laws of logic and reason. And God was faithful enough to answer that. And make a long story short, he took me on that journey. He introduced me to information and to people who were brilliant men and women of God who put me on the right path. And it showed me that not only does God make sense, not only can God be known, he wants to be known and he delights in being known.
Yeah.
And I figured that I'm not alone in this. So I created Faith by Reason in order to help my fellow Christians who are on the same journey understand why why their faith makes sense. And I use, again, logic, reason, systematic analysis.
No, it definitely does take us on a journey, and that's one of the things I'm thankful for. I mean, over the last nearly 24 years, God putting me in contact with faithful people who then tell you, oh, read this book, read that book, and I've got, shelves full of books that are, essential reading. I like to read old authors, the Puritans, Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, real guys who have real insight. It's not like candy floss, it's like eating a steak, it's really it's something to get your teeth into, and I'm thankful, for that. And I'm thankful for doing this podcast and people like you coming on. I get to talk, to people all around the world about different topics. And the topic that we're going to talk about today is something that I have spoken about before on here, is Satan's little season theory. And it's a popular theory online. I had a guest on here previously talking about it who was a proponent of it. Um, but what's your take on this little season theory?
Sure. So like you, I heard about it. through other people and some videos that I saw on YouTube. And oh, I'm sorry, let me back up. So one thing I forgot to mention, and I'll mention it again at the end, is I'm starting a Patreon. Starting probably in February of 2025. So just be on the lookout for that, and you'll see it on my website on faithbyreason.net. But I wanted to make sure I didn't mention that because I'm working on it. But back to the question about the little season, I saw it on some YouTube videos, and some people were in my comment section were telling me about it. You need to get into this little season. You need to figure it out. I think we're in the little season. So I said, okay. So I started looking into it and researching it. And to give you my summary take on it, I am not a proponent of it. I do not believe that we are in the little season, and I think and my reason for it is not just because it doesn't match my personal eschatology. And if you want to know more about my personal eschatology, I've done an entire series on the book of Revelation that is available right now on my website and on YouTube, 60 episodes with a deep dive of it. And you will see that, my eschatology, I'm more of I guess you would call it a futurist, wherein I believe that most of end times prophecy has not occurred yet. I believe that everything in the book of Revelation from about chapter 4 all the way to the end is yet future, which is, not what the little season folks believe. But even though on first glance, it didn't seem to make sense to me. I wanted to research it. I wanted to, because I'm a contrastive thinker. I try to prove the other person right, even if I don't agree with them. And if I can't prove them right, then I feel more comfortable in my situation. So I looked at it, and again, in summary, it doesn't fit logic, it doesn't fit history, and most importantly, it doesn't fit what the Bible says about this period of time. So just quickly, I know that you had another guest on who talked about this, so your listeners are probably familiar. But in case they aren't, in essence, what the little season what the little season theory states is that we are in a period of time that is post-millennial. So you have the so-called tribulation, the last 7 years of human and evil rule on the earth, the 70th week of Daniel, excuse me, from Daniel chapter 9. And that period has already happened. That 7 year period concludes with the Battle of Armageddon, wherein Jesus returns in his second coming, and he returns and sets up a kingdom. And there's a 1,000 year period in this kingdom wherein Satan, the devil, the dragon, is locked away in the abyss, in the bottomless pit for a 1,000 year period. And during that period, but while he's locked up, Jesus rules over the current earth, and there are good and evil people in the earth at that time. I talk about this in my Revelation series. But then at the end of that 1,000 years, the Bible says that Satan is released from his prison for a little season. And during that little season, of course, this is the titular little season that people are talking about. During that little season, he has one job. He does one thing. He gathers the nations of the world against Jerusalem, to make war against Jerusalem, and then fire comes down from heaven, devours them, and that basically ends everything that's all the evil in the world is done, and then evil is judged at the great white throne judgment. Then we go into eternity, the new Jerusalem. The idea is that we are currently in this little season of a period, which means that the tribulation, those last 7 years, already occurred. That the 1,000 years where Satan has been locked away has already occurred. That the return of Jesus happened over 1,000 years ago. And now we are in this last segment before the final judgment. So that's what the little season states. And my reasons for it, again, not believing it, is that in a nutshell, there is no evidence for it. None whatsoever. Now, there is some tertiary evidence called Tartaria, which we'll probably get into. But and again, even that's extremely specious. But aside from that, there is no evidence for it. I tried to argue on their behalf. And how can this be right? How could this possibly be true? What would the world look like if this were true? And it just does not match anything. And once you really get down to it, it almost becomes ludicrous that this is even believed. But I will go step by step through it and give you my reasoning from beginning to end.
Yeah, I mean, I listen to people and then I go away me and analyze it. But obviously, the main thing for me is if it contradicts the scriptures, it's not true. And that's as simple. I don't care how popular it is. I don't care who's telling me. if it contradicts the Holy Bible, it isn't true. End of, full stop. And obviously, um, one of the things that they talk about in the little season is um, like they're basically saying that, you know, when Jesus says certain things, for example, like about him coming quickly,
Hmm.
he talks about it in Revelation. Behold, I come quickly.
Hmm.
But I've got my Vine's expository dictionary,
Hmm.
and I would recommend people get things like this. I've had this for over 20 years. And if you go to that and it says there about quickly, it's the word tachu,
Yeah,
Tachu, which means swift.
right.
I
Exactly.
mean, so that's what we're talking about, aren't we? People are basically, as far as I understand it, they're going in and they're taking these English words and saying, "Look, it's saying this," and then they're saying to people like you and I who say, "Well, no," they're saying, "Oh, well, you're saying he's a liar then."
Yeah. So when people ask me, I get asked a lot, what's the best way to interpret the Bible? And there are rules, and I have it on my site somewhere, buried in there, that there are 5 rules that I give when interpreting the Bible. And at the top of that, well, one of them, the top two, I would say, are context and language. Keep in mind that the Bible is not written in English. It was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. So we cannot take our our English or whatever language you happen to be speaking, whatever modern language you're speaking, and take our current, not just our language interpretation, but also our pop culture vernacular, and ascribe that to the Bible. Like you said, the word for is quickly is also in Greek is I pronounce it takeo,
Check
but
it, yeah.
it's the same word where we get on our vehicles the word our tachometer. It comes from the same word. What does the tachometer measure? It does not measure your speed. Your accelerate, your speedometer shows your speed. Your tachometer it
Distance.
shows how fast you're accelerating. So what he's saying is that when these things happen, they will be happening at an accelerated rate. So that's what he's saying. He's not saying I'm coming tomorrow. He's saying these things will be happening in an accelerated rate. See, he says, so when he says in the Revelation chapter 1, um, which I think is what you were quoting, it says that he came to show his servants things which must takeo come to pass. Not they will come to pass quickly, but they will come to pass at accelerated fashion. Basically, 7 years is when everything's going to wrap up. God is going to take care of his judgments very quickly because God does not like judging. I talk about this in my Revelation series.
Mm.
Judging is probably God's least favorite thing to do. That is not who he is. That is what circumstances has forced him to become. But if you look at what God wants, and again, I'm getting a little bit off topic. I promise I'll come back. But because I'm doing a series, I just started a series on Genesis, and which is a great place to go after Revelation, because at the end of Revelation, God gets back what he originally wanted in Eden. And in Eden, he didn't want to judge anyone. Eden, he just gave us this beautiful world. And he told us the world is yours, Adam and Eve, and your children. Go out, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and make the earth like Eden. Rule over it. And in the cool of the day, we will walk and talk. That's what he wants. Now we forced him into being judgmental because God is holy and he is righteous and just. And a righteous and just God cannot let evil go unpunished, but he doesn't like doing it. He wants us to have joy and peace and happiness and just be with him. So my point in saying all that is that these things come to pass quickly because God wants to get the judgment out of the way and get to the good stuff, to eternity with him. So as far as the little season is concerned, the way I look at it is I ask myself, if this was correct, being contrasted, what would the world look like? Well, look at what would have had to have happened. At least 1,007 years ago, the tribulation, which will have had to have started. What happens in the tribulation? Well, first, and during this period of time, you have the so-called rapture. I'm not going to get into that. That is highly controversial. I talk about it a lot on Faith by Reason. But at some point, whether you believe in a pre, mid, or post-tribulation rapture, that has happened 1,007 years ago. And then you have some devastating things occur in the world. You have the 4 horsemen who ride at the beginning of that period of time. And with the 6th horseman, you have this great earthquake that moves every mountain and island out of its place. You have the judgments during the trumpets, the trumpet judgments, where a third of the green grass is burned up, a third of the population of the earth is killed by these demonic hordes. You have um, the waters turn bitter. You have darkness all over the earth. You have just like incredibly terrible things happening. And remember, Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 24 that this period of time, and he was talking about the end time, the disciples were asking him, what will be the signs right before your second coming? He said it will be, there was no time on earth that's ever been like this, meaning this is worse than the flood. What happened to the flood? The whole world was flooded and changed the topography of the entire earth. This is going to be worse than that. Again, islands and mountains moved out of their places. You have, these devastating judgments, and then you get to the final judgments, the wrath of God, the bowl judgments, where again, all trees and green grass are burned up. All the water in the earth, fresh and salt water, is turned to blood, like the blood of a dead man in the cases of the ocean. You have these grievous sores over everyone's bodies. You have, before that, you have this ruler, the Antichrist, who comes and desecrates the temple and has the mark and forces people to take this mark in their right hand or forehead so that they can't buy or sell, and that the world is forced to worship him. And you have all these wars. You have about roughly half the population of the world is killed, according to Revelation. And then at the very end, you have this earthquake that's so great that the mountains are no longer found, and every island is gone. This would be the most devastating period of time in human history. This, according to the little season, happened over 1,000 years ago. Question is, where's the evidence of it? Historically, wouldn't someone have jotted that down? That all the water in the world is blood, that there are no more mountains? And if all the mountains went away, why do we still have mountains? I can look out my window right now. I'm close to a mountain range. I can look at right now. There it is. The mountain is there. It's not gone. Why? How does the mountains come by? Why are there islands? I'm an avid scuba diver. I've been to many islands in my life. My family and I were just last year in the Hawaiian Islands. They're still there. How have the islands come back? Well, I suppose you could say that when Jesus returned, he brought the islands and mountains back up, I guess. But why are they exactly where they were before? We have maps of the world from before the time of Jesus. The topography is exactly the same. So Jesus brought the mountains right back up exactly the way they were before, with the same geological features and fossils that they had before. Does that really make sense? Now, some people will say, especially the little season people will say, well, that's symbolic. You're taking this too literally. He doesn't really mean that mountains and islands literally went away. He doesn't mean that rivers and oceans literally turned to blood. There's a problem with that. We do not have carte blanche to decide what is and what is not literal in the Bible to fit our favorite theory. I'll get back to that. But the problem is that these things had to have happened to some degree in the past, but there is no record of it. The return of Jesus at the end of the 7-year period, this would have been the greatest event in the history of the world. The return bodily of the co-creator of the universe coming back down to earth, ruling from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. Where is that? Where's the evidence of it? Now, again, there's the hidden history idea. The idea that, well, somehow history has just been erased. You're ascribing a great deal of power to Satan if you believe that he's able to erase history, to obfuscate 1,000 years of history, where, again, it's not just that Jesus was here and ruled. There's a lot more to this period of time than just him coming back. This 1,000-year period, there is accompanied by the resurrection of the saints. Everyone who believed in Jesus and in the promise of Jesus, from Adam all the way to the day before Jesus returned, who died, they are back on earth in supernatural resurrected bodies that were similar to the bodies that Jesus had when he resurrected, to the body that Jesus had when he resurrected. Jesus, in his resurrected body, he was on earth for 40 days. What did he do? He could enter and leave rooms without using the door. He could just appear and disappear. The bodies were supernatural. So that means that for 1,000 years, you had Noah and Abraham and King David and Daniel and all the different prophets and everyone who ever believed and got the disciples, Peter, Paul, James, here in supernatural bodies as co-regents ruling and reigning with Jesus for 1,000 years. Where's the evidence of that? Are you really telling me you could hide that? But there's more, Paul. And I'll let you talk in a second. But let's look at the other changes that are in the earth. And this is not my opinion. This is what the Bible says. In the book of Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah are vivid descriptions of what that 1,000-year period is going to be like. In addition to supernatural rule by Jesus and saints, you're going to have the animal world is different. It says that during this period of time, the lion eats straw like an ox. Apparently, they're no more carnivores. The lion, it changes their entire digestive system of carnivorous animals. The wolf and the lamb lie down together. Okay, so they're all animals are going to be tamed. It says that children will play on the hole of the poisonous snakes. So all animals are going to be tamed. Actually, it's going to be like the antediluvian period, the pre-flood period during this time, because it's going to be long life. It says that someone who dies at 100 years old is going to be considered a child. Like during this period, if someone dies at 100, you're going to say, "Oh, that poor kid never had a chance to live its full life." So I think people are going to be, it's clear that people are going to be living for hundreds of years like they did in the pre-flood time, where people averaged living 6, 7, 800 years. What happened? Why isn't that happening now? What happened to end that? Why are there no people who are alive that long? Why are animals no longer tame? Why are lions no longer eating straw? Go to your local zoo. You won't find them feeding bales of hay to lions. They're eating meat. So something happened and changed that all the way back around. And here's the big question. Where's Jesus? So apparently Jesus must have ruled for 1,000 years and he said, okay, guys, I'm out. Take it easy. Why? Why did he leave? Where did he go? I guess he took all the saints with him and then he changed everything back to the way it was before. The Bible doesn't say that. It doesn't imply that. In fact, it says the opposite. In the book of Daniel, in the writings of Paul, this kingdom is called an everlasting kingdom. That 1,000-year period is not the entirety of Jesus' kingdom. The 1,000-year period serves a specific purpose with Satan being locked away. It's really there to prove that mankind, even if they're under a perfect rule by Jesus for 1,000 years, man will still rebel. That's what the little season is really for, is to prove that mankind's heart is irredeemably evil, and that even after a perfect rule of Jesus for 1,000 years, the first chance they get, they will rebel. But his kingdom is everlasting. And you look at the original Hebrew and Greek, for everlasting, it means the same thing. It means without end. So if Jesus' kingdom is without end, then Jesus should still be here. If he came back 1,000+ years ago, he would not have left, unless you believe that the Bible is wrong. And lastly, well, I'll let you talk now, because I've said a lot.
Yeah, I mean, the proponents of the little season theory, I'm not saying that this is what they all say, just the ones,
Mhm.
some of the ones I've heard and spoken to. They say that Jesus is at the North Pole and the North Pole's moving around. Just let that sink in, guys. That's the answer
Yeah, well,
they give.
the
And all the
problem is,
saints.
well, the problem is that Jerusalem. Yeah, I've heard that same thing too. I've had people say, well,
Mm.
you don't know where Jerusalem really is." Okay, when did it move? Why did it move? How did it move? Because the Bible is very clear that Jerusalem is in Israel. The
Yeah.
topography of Israel has not changed. Jerusalem is still there. And let's say Jesus is in the North Pole. If Jesus is in the North Pole and he's still ruling, he's doing a really lousy job. He is if he is ruling the world now, his kingdom, I'm gonna be honest with you, his kingdom sucks. And it's not, and he is not ruling it in the way that the Bible said he was ruling it. And this North Pole stuff, yes, there's an old saying in the information sciences that if you torture the data long enough, it'll confess to anything. Meaning that
Yes.
if you can twist things around to make anything true, if you want it to be, you can always say, well, he's in the North Pole. Great. Do you have any evidence for that? Well, how do you know he's not in the North Pole?
Yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah.
no, that's not how things work, folks.
No.
But even so, then what is Satan supposed to be doing during his little season? He has one job and one job only. And by the way, and that job is to gather the nations against Jerusalem, wherever it might be, to battle against Jesus. So have you seen any evidence that right now the purpose of nations is to gather to fight Jerusalem to fight against Jerusalem wherever it might be? No, there's not a no, that's not happening. So if that's what the deal is, then you're telling me that Satan is able to contort God's will and say that and basically nullify God's will and God's word, because Satan is not doing what he's supposed to be doing in the little season. Furthermore, that term little season, let's just look at that. Again, the original language, that word little is micronos. Micronos means, as it would imply, tiny. And we see that term little season elsewhere in the book of Revelation. If you look in Revelation chapter 6, at the opening of the fifth seal with the where we see the martyrs in heaven, and they're crying out to God, saying, "When are you going to avenge us?" Excuse me. When are you going to avenge us on Satan? And God says that these are the words of God. He says, "Just wait for a little season, Micronos." How long is that little season? How long is it? Because this is happening at the beginning of the tribulation. It's about 3.5 years before God actually starts to judge the world. Now, I could be generous and say that maybe you could say the true judgments, the bowls of wrath, don't happen until the end of the tribulation. So let's say that micronos, that little season, is only 7 years. Fine. Why would it be 7 years in Revelation chapter 6, but then be much longer than that in Revelation chapter 9, chapter 20? Because if the little season is true, then it's been at least 150 years. Why do I say 150 years? Because obviously it's lasted longer than 7 years. It's Satan's been, my lifetime. I've not experienced any of the events of the millennium. My grandfather hasn't, and my great grandfather hasn't. And we have basically 150 years of what's called collective memory, where we have the stories that we hear from our grandparents, and they have the story they hear from their grandparents. That's about roughly 150 years. So we know that it's been at least that long that we have some type of history going. And so that means that if this little season is true, then it's been at least 150 years. So why would it be 7 years in chapter 6, and then at minimum 150 years that we know that that's been between the time that I guess Jesus left and released Satan, and now it doesn't make sense. And then why for that 150 years has Satan been doing everything but what God said he's going to do? So if you believe that, then you basically believe that Satan can say, "Hey, God, screw you. I know you said that this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do something different." No, Satan does not have that power. Satan can only do what God allows. And God made it very clear in the Bible what Satan's going to be doing during this time. And he's not doing it. So again, there's no evidence for it.
No, I mean, people ascribe too much power to the devil. Well, you get people that ascribe too much power to him, and then others that ascribe too little power. And we need to be realistic with regards to the devil. He's an immensely powerful being. However, God's sovereign, and he has Satan on a leash, and Satan is God's devil and that's the reality of it. And he's used, Satan is used. I mean, it's not like there's this battle going on between God and Satan, and somehow at the end God just manages to win. He gets the victory. Like, it's nothing. Satan's a created being. He knows how powerful God is. I mean, and I often think of this. Does he actually think he's going to win? I don't think he does, but he is self-deceiving, because he deceives everyone, deceives himself, deceives all the other fallen angels. But I think he might think he can somehow get out of it on a technicality. I don't believe he thinks he's going to win, because when it talks about Satan, it doesn't say that he wanted to ascend above the Most High. It said he wanted to be like him. So he knows he can't. He knows he can't be more powerful than him. So people are ascribing too much power. If Christ has come, he's reigned, and then the devil's completely wiped all evidence out completely, and collective memory, it's all gone. But you mentioned there about data, and how people, can basically make it say whatever they want. And it just reminded me of 2 Peter 3:16, where it says, as also in all his epistles, speaking in them, and he's obviously speaking about Paul, of these things in which some things are hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable rest, or it means to rend, as they do the other scriptures, unto their own destruction. And the word rest that's used in the King James Version, it really means to almost, the thought is almost put it on a torture rack and torture it, then get it to say what you want it to say. And unfortunately, you within this sphere of podcasting, and people on YouTube, they start their own YouTube channels. They think there's some kind of guru on a particular topic. They get some traction, and then they carry on promoting this particular view, and I think that's what's happening with this little season theory. And unfortunately, people who don't have a deep enough knowledge of the scriptures, they don't know how to expound the scriptures, and they take these novel ideas on board. And this is what it is: it's a novel idea, and they're trying to explain. Obviously, we're gonna get into it. This sort of old world. We know there's these buildings that don't make sense. Every country on earth. I mean, I go around different places and I have a look at them and think, yes, it is out of place. We don't know the answer to it, but people are trying to explain these things. Um,
Right.
and um, Obviously, one of the other points that I just wanted to sort of mention was when they talk about when the Lord says about this generation will
Mm.
not pass away, and they say that He's saying that it's this generation He's talking to there, but it isn't, is it? He doesn't mean that.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to talk about that. Then I'm going to go back to a few other things you said. She said a lot of really good
Yeah,
things that I was just noting. So I'm to make sure I don't forget them. But I'll start with what you were saying about this generation shall not pass until all these things take place. And that's when we really get down to why this is believed. Because when I went through the little season and I just said, this doesn't make sense. Why do people believe it? Well, it turns out it really dovetails into another belief system that has adopted the little season in order to kind of prop up their beliefs on eschatology, and we'll get into that. But in addition to other verses, they use this same verse that you just talked about. This generation will not pass away, so it must be the generation Jesus was talking about. Except again, one of the rules of biblical interpretation is context. What is Jesus talking about when when and this comes from Matthew 24 when he says this generation shall not pass. In Matthew 24, Jesus is answering two questions from his disciples. The disciples brought him to see, they're basically showing off the temple. It was Herod's temple. It was really beautifully done. And they were showing it off to Jesus. And Jesus said, you know what? I know I'm paraphrasing, of course. Yeah, this is a great building, but it is going to come a time where it's going to be taken down so much that one stone will not be upon the other. And the disciples, kind of it disturbed them. And they asked him two questions. They said, when will these things be? That is the destruction of the temple. That's one question. Question number two is, what will be the sign? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Future. So he answered the questions, and he answered about the destruction of the temple, and then the sign of his coming are two completely different answers. And when he's talking about the sign of his second coming, he is speaking about the future. So when he's talking about that generation that sees all of these things happen, that generation shall not pass until all of these things happen. So he is speaking to a future generation. You have to look at the context in which he was speaking. He was not speaking to a present generation. And and here's the thing, even if you believed he was, because I can understand, you can say, well, this generation could mean this president. I understand he never used the word this. You know why? Because this is an English word. He never said the word this. It never came out of his mouth. The English language, as we know it, did not even exist in the first century. So how do we know what the interpreters of the Bible, why they put the word this there? They were speaking because I've had the same debate with others, and they said, well, if that was the case, he should have said that generation. He wouldn't have said that because the word that didn't exist. Where is he talking about? In this point in his answer, he is talking about the future. So he has to be talking about a future generation. And even if you believed he did, all you have to do is look in the first century. The generation passed, and all those things did not take place. Which is what I talked about, earlier on.
Mhm.
The tribulation has not happened yet. How do I know it hasn't happened yet? Because it hasn't happened. There's no evidence for it, not any at all. And one of the excuses that the people who promote the little season say is, well, history has been erased. All that. Okay, let's just look at this logically. Do the powers that be have the ability to affect our understanding of history? I'm not going to argue against that. Sure, they can. They can obfuscate history. But there's a huge difference between obfuscating history, saying things that happened, to say that things happened differently than they actually did. That's one thing. But to make something completely disappear from history, that is a huge undertaking. And the bigger the event, the more difficult it is to happen. It is to do, not just because of our traditions and our history that is passed on, but also because there is other independent evidence of it. And to say that the Satan and the elites of the world and his minions, human and otherwise, made 1,000 years disappear. Let's look at some of the biggest, perhaps the biggest event here in the States of the last 25, 30 years, 9/11. There are a lot of conspiracy theories around 9/11. And even I don't believe everything in the official record. They don't make sense. But people are working hard to obfuscate that. You can obfuscate the history, but you are not going to convince anyone living today that 9/11 didn't happen. Why? Because there are eyewitnesses. There is physical evidence of it. My two children, we talked beforehand about, we both have boys. My boys are 8 and 11. Excuse me, 8 and 10. They were not alive, but their dad was. Their dad has told them those stories. My kids did not see 9/11, but they know it happened because their dad told them. Now, maybe in the future, in a history book, they'll obfuscate it even more. But there's a difference between saying it didn't happen the way you thought it happened versus it never happened. My grandfather fought in World War II. I wasn't alive then. He's told me stories about how he was on the front lines and D-Day in Normandy, on the beaches of Normandy. And there's a huge conspiracy theory that the United States allowed the Pearl Harbor attack to happen in order to get the U.S. into the war. That will be different than the official story. Now, that you can obfuscate history, but to make it erase, but to erase it, that's extraordinarily difficult. That takes an incredible amount of power. An example, every other major empire in the world, we have tons of evidence of it. The Egyptian Empire, 4,000 years ago, we have tons of evidence that it existed. The Greek Empire, most of our Western civilization is based on the philosophy and the government that was established in the Greek Empire. And that was, 2,500 years ago. The Persian Empire, that's where we get our systems of mathematics and numerology from. The Roman Empire, there's evidence of that. You go to Italy today. I mean, my wife and I were there a few years ago. Extraordinary evidence, not just that they existed, but what life was like, what they ate and drank, what their philosophy, their stories, their religion, all of that is still around. But you're going to tell me that somehow you were able to erase 1,000 years of the greatest, what would have been the greatest kingdom in the history of the world, ruled over by the Son of God in a supernatural body, with supernatural regions all over the world, with animal life different, with human lifespans different, with perfect peace. Does that truly make sense? Satan, like you said before, Satan is not that powerful. Not only is Satan, in order for that to happen, Satan would have to be more powerful than God. Let me tell you really quickly about another piece of history that Satan would love to erase that somehow he wasn't able to. The first advent of Jesus. Jesus was on earth for 33 years. During that 33 years, aside from one quick sojourn into Egypt, Jesus was only in Israel, a little narrow strip of land about the size of New Jersey here in the United States. He never left that area. His ministry was only 3 years. He was only active for 3 years. Don't you think Satan would have loved to erase that if he could? His first advent, his death and resurrection? Yet it still exists to this day. Why? If Satan was not able to erase 3 years that only really occurred in a narrow strip of land in the Middle East, if he couldn't do that, and I can't believe he wouldn't have loved to have done it, how on earth could he have erased 1,000 years of a worldwide empire supernaturally ruled over by Jesus and supernatural regents for 1,000 years? Does that truly make sense? Satan is not that powerful. If God can preserve 3 years of the life of his son, you're telling me he can't preserve 1,000 years of his kingdom that he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to the disciples, to us? Satan is not that powerful. Not only is Satan not more powerful than God, Satan is not more powerful than you and I, if you're a Christian. How do we know that? What did Jesus come to do? Yes, die for our sins, absolutely. But he also came to give us power over the spiritual realm. You know why it was such a big deal that Jesus cast out demons? Because no one had ever done it before. No one had the power to command demons to leave. And Jesus gave that same power to his disciples while he was alive. And then when he died and rose again, he said he gave that power to all of us. We all have power over the spiritual realm. Satan is not more powerful than you and I. Now, granted, we don't use that power to the degree that we should, but we are more powerful than Satan. Satan, do you know that if you are being oppressed by spiritual evil, you can just say the name Jesus and they flee? It says that resist, it says this in the Bible, resist the devil and he will flee from you. How powerful can he be if your resistance can make him flee? Does not mean, okay, I'll just reluctantly leave. No, he runs. Satan, the devil, the great dragon. We have more power. We have more power than he does. Now, why is the world in the shape it's in? It's because we don't use the power, but we have it. Satan is not more powerful than God. He is not more powerful than you and I. He does not have the power to erase 1,000 years of the kingdom that God promised to everyone in the Bible. I don't believe in. If you believe that, then you must believe again that Satan is more powerful than God. So I want to talk really quick. So I mentioned before about some of the excuses that are rationale that the little season people gave, and you can give some more. I'm more than happy to address them. But the two I get the most is that I'm taking the Bible too literally when I talk about, mountains and trees burning up and disappearing and things like that. And the other one is, of course, the history being erased. And I just addressed that. But when you say that you cannot take certain parts of the Bible literal, the question is, which parts can you not take literally? Surely you don't mean the entire Bible. Of course, there have to be parts of the Bible that we take literally. We have to believe that Jesus literally, physically came down to earth. So that's not. But where do you draw the line? Well, we don't have that carte blanche. There are certain rules in place for whether something is literal or symbolic. And yes, there's absolutely symbolism in the Bible. There is allegory in the Bible. But God does not just randomly put the allegory in there, willy-nilly. When something is in the Bible allegorically or non-literally, there are two ways you can know. First of all, if it's or two ways to deal with it. One is that it's always interpreted. Everything that God says symbolically is interpreted. There is nothing symbolically in the Bible that is not given an interpretation. Most of the time, that interpretation is given right in the same passage. The book of Daniel is a great example of this. In chapter 2 of the book of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of this statue made of 5 different metals. In that same chapter, God gives Daniel the interpretation that the statue with the 4 metals represent 4 different kingdoms. Done right then and there. Then you have another Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel has a vision of these 4 beasts that rule the earth. And in that same chapter, an angel comes and gives Daniel the interpretation that those 4 beasts are 4 kingdoms through which Satan is going to try to rule the world. Their interpretations are usually given immediately. And if they're not given immediately, then they're elsewhere in the Bible. Revelation chapter 1 is another great example. In Revelation chapter 1, the Apostle John is given a vision of Jesus with hair like wool, and he has a gold sash and a white robe, and he has in his hand 7 stars, and he walks among 7 candlesticks. In that same chapter, Jesus himself says, "Oh, by the way, those 7 stars are the 7 angels of the 7 churches, and those 7 lampstands are the 7 churches." But what about the other stuff? That's interpreted elsewhere in the Bible. A gold sash is a symbol of royalty. A white robe is a symbol of priesthood. And so we know that because it's elsewhere in the Bible, or it's given right then and there. The idea that some of the little season people will say, well, when it says that mountains are thrown down, well, mountains can sometimes in the Bible mean governments, and that's correct. In fact, in Revelation chapter 17, it says that that's the prophecy of the great harlot who rides the beast, the woman who rides the beast. And it says that this woman sits on 7 hills or 7 mountains. And it says right there in the same chapter, these 7 mountains are basically 7 governments that the woman rules over. So it gives the interpretation right there. However, when you see the mountains thrown down, it is not interpreted that way. It does not say that these mountains are not literal. It does not give a different interpretation of those mountains. It is so if you do not see it put into a form of a vision, or if it's not translated or interpreted by someone there, then you should take it literally. Now, I will give you one last example. If you look in Revelation chapter 12, you see John has a vision. So first of all, he says it's a vision, so we know it's not literal. He says he has a vision of a woman who's clothed with the sun, stars, 12 stars around her head, and the moon under her feet. Okay, now an interpretation isn't immediately given. However, we see an interpretation of that in Genesis earlier, where the the patriarch Joseph has a dream where the sun, moon, and 12 stars bow down before him. And it's interpreted by his father Jacob. And Jacob says, well, you're saying that me, your mother, and your 12 brothers are going to bow down before you. So the sun and the moon are Jacob and his wife, Rachel, and the 12 stars were the 12, the 11 stars were the 11 tribes plus Joseph, the 12 tribes of Israel. So clearly this woman represents Israel. So we've seen that before, clearly in the Bible. So to wrap it up, if something is symbolic, first of all, it will look like a vision. It will clearly say, this is a vision. This is not literal. And then you will find an interpretation either immediately or someplace else in the Bible. If it's not, then you need to take it literally. You need to default to taking it literally. So what that means is you cannot just decide what's literal and what's not based on whether or not it fits your favorite pet theory. Don't conform the Bible to your theory. Conform your theory to the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. If whatever you're thinking isn't in line with the scriptures, then you're wrong and the Bible's right. And
Exactly.
one thing I would say to that, one of the things that I hear often, and you get people coming doing videos and they say, God told me this and God told me that. It really, really annoys me because when they need to be very, very careful when they're saying God told me or God said. If what you're saying doesn't line up with the scriptures, God has not told you. He has not told you because the spirit and the word agree always, always, always. The spirit will never contradict the word ever. So if you're
Exactly.
if you're going to come to me and say God told me this and it is not in the Bible and it contradicts it, he hasn't told you. It's the devil. End of. Or you've
Yep.
just made it up in your own mind. But one of the things that they talk about, the little season people, and the people who believe in the little season, obviously, are professing Christians who have sort of responded to this Tartaria theory of people
Yes.
who are not Christians. They talk about this old world. And, I've looked into this. I've physically looked into it. I've gone to places, I've gone back up home to the northwest of England. I've gone to Manchester. I've gone to Liverpool with my job. I move around a lot. I go to lots of these places. And I go and have a look at some of these old buildings. Sometimes buildings I've probably walked past loads of times and not paid any attention to. And I look at them and I analyze them and I think, yeah, they do look out of place. And, one off the, when you come out of the train station in Liverpool, there's a building immediately in front of you, a huge building with columns, huge doors. I've done videos on them, absolutely huge doors, clearly made not by average sized people, let's say. That's what it looks like anyway when you're looking at it. And then there's other buildings that have rooms that are below ground. Like you can tell that the pavement level wasn't always where it is because these buildings have windows and doorways down. You think, well, why have they got windows down there? So yeah, and this is all around the world. It's not just over here in the UK, it's in the US. You can go to whatever, Canada, Russia, it's all over the world. And there's this theory, this Tartaria theory. So, that there's this advanced civilization from sort of the southern Russian steppe region, and they were an advanced civilization, and this is the reason why there's these buildings all over. I mean, what are your thoughts on this sort of old world theory, this Tartaria theory?
I'm going to give you two quick answers. Quick answer number one, I don't know. And quick answer number two, just because you don't know something doesn't mean you can fit anything you want into it. So I am not an expert on Tatari. I've done some study on it. It is fascinating. It truly is, like as you said, it's all over the world. There's even some locally that I live near a major city. And in that city, there's one of these so-called Tatarian buildings that was in that old world order video. It's actually the Capitol building for that city. And it's tough to explain. I don't, but just because you don't know something doesn't, again, you don't have the carte blanche to just shove all of your theories into it unless there's some reason for it. Now, if you show me a Tartarian building that has some type of artwork on it that depicts the millennium, Because this is what the Little Caesar folks say. They say, well, this is evidence that Jesus was here and he gave this advanced technology and architecture. And of course, Jesus would do that. So this shows that there was an advanced civilization that left in the recent past, and this is Jesus. Okay, those are two different thoughts. One thought is that there was some advancements in recent history that we don't understand. And thought number two, that must have been Jesus. Thought number one, there's some evidence behind it. It looks like there is evidence that these Tartarian buildings have some type of technology that has been hidden or lost from us. But that does not automatically mean that it's from Jesus. Now, if you show me a Tartarian building that has the words "Jesus was here" on there or something like that, I mean, again, I talked about it when I was in Italy. And in Italy, they have a lot of these so-called Tartarian structures. When we were in Florence, there, like you said, there was this huge building that I guess was used as a cathedral. The doors were gigantic. It looks like if the only people who could open this door, you'd have to be at least 13 feet tall to reach the doorknob. I don't get that. That makes no sense to me. There's something going on there that I don't understand that may have been hidden from me. But inside of those buildings, I see artwork, but that artwork is medieval artwork. It's artwork showing, things that happened during the medieval period. If these were from the time of Jesus, shouldn't there be? Because in all of our structures and our art is part of history. There should be artwork about the 1,000-year reign of Jesus. There should be songs about it. There should be culture. Again, as I said before, every major empire in history, we know about their culture, about their songs, about their poetry. And it's because it's on their artwork, it's on their buildings, it's on their structure. Egyptian hieroglyphs. You go to the Parthenon, you see writings about things that happened during that time. You go to the Colosseum in Italy, you see evidence of what life was like. Shouldn't these Tartarian buildings, if they were from the time of the millennium, have some type of evidence on them? Shouldn't there be an artwork of Moses fishing in the Mediterranean in his favorite fishing hole there? Shouldn't there be a picture of Jesus ruling from Jerusalem? Shouldn't there be some evidence, something that says this building was built during the time of the millennial reign of Christ, when all these amazing things would happen? Shouldn't there be a picture of a lion eating a bale of hay? Shouldn't there be something? But there isn't. I've been inside these buildings, not all of them, obviously, but the few that I have been inside of, there is nothing about that building that says, yeah, Jesus was here, and here's some evidence of what the culture was like during this 1,000-year period. There isn't any. So you have two separate things. You have the mystery of Tartaria and you have the second coming of Jesus. They don't fit together. There is nothing that brings them together in these Tartarian buildings. Nothing about them at all. I'm waiting for, I've watched the videos of the people who talk about Tartaria. I've watched the videos of people who talk about this, the Little Caesar. And by the way, most of the Tartarian people don't even mention the Little Caesar because they aren't interested in anything that has to do with Jesus. This is what people who believe in the Little Caesar have decided. They basically decided that they're going to basically kidnap the Tartarian. They're going to hijack, not kidnap's not the right word. They're going to hijack Tartaria to fit their theory. So I don't want to be on here forever. We have a limited time, but I want to give my one final thought, and then you can come back and you can give me any other questions you want. But because after I did my study of the Little Caesar and looked into it and just realized it just doesn't make any sense in the matter of logic, history, or the Bible, my question was, why do people believe this so fervently? Then I started noticing something that was common in most of the people, if not all of them, who are purporting this theory. They all say one more piece of evidence as their reasoning. They say that Jesus promised his disciples that he would return during their lifetime. Therefore, the second coming has to have happened in the first century. And ergo, the 1,000 years and so forth. So that's why we're in the Little Caesar. When I heard that, I understood what's going on. Because that idea that Jesus promised he would return during the lifetime of his disciples is the catchphrase, the watchword of a group of people who call themselves preterists. What is preterism? What's preterism? Preterism is the idea, basically, that 99% of prophecies already happened. Everything from the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 1:1, all the way up until basically now, and they consider now me the millennial reign of Christ has already happened. And they base this theory on a really bad interpretation of Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. Matthew 16, verse 18 reads, I'm slightly paraphrasing because I don't have it in front of me. It says, verily I say unto you, there are some of you standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. People who believe in preterism interpret that to me, because Jesus was talking to some of his followers, that he was saying that there's some people who will live, who will not die, who will live to see him coming in his kingdom. And they say coming into his kingdom means his second coming. So he's basically saying that people will be alive to see him come back in his second coming, which means that the second coming would have had to have happened in the first century. Okay, well, what happened in the first century? Of course, it's his second coming. The tribulation precedes that time, and the tribulation is this devastating period of time. So what in the first century closely resembles, or as close as possible, resembles what might have happened during the tribulation? Well, they 70 AD. The siege of Jerusalem by the Roman Empire, by Titus Vespasian, and it was a devastating time. The 3 Roman legions came down to Israel. They completely destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. That's what Jesus was talking about when his disciples asked him those questions in Matthew 24. They destroyed the temple. They wholesale slaughtered the Jews. They drove them out of their land. That was when the diaspora began, which did not end until Israel became a nation again. It drove them out of them. They literally wiped Israel off the map. They renamed Israel Palestinia, which is Greek for Philistines. They call it the land of the Philistines, which is where we get the term Palestine to this day, whole other thing. And so, yeah, it was a devastating period of time. So they said, well, that, the seven last years are called the time of Jacob's trouble. It's a time where Israel will be judged for rejecting the Messiah, among other things, because and to let them know that, well, the point of the tribulation for the Jews is so that they will finally recognize that their Messiah came 2,000 years ago, and they'll call for him. But anyway, it's focused on Israel. So the preterists say, well, this must be it. So that means that Jesus must have come at around 70 AD, because that's when all these devastating things happen. Problem is, of course, there's no evidence for it. Since there's no evidence that Jesus came back, no one decided to jot down the greatest event in history, and the 70 AD does not really match all the devastation of the tribulation. And they say, well, it had to have happened, so it must not be literal. It must be symbolic. Again, the rivers and oceans turning to blood is symbolic. The demonic armies, that's symbolic. The Antichrist, well, Titus Vespasian must have been the Antichrist, even though he didn't do anything the Antichrist said he was going to do. Even though the Bible says he's going to do, he didn't institute the mark of the beast. It must be symbolic. It must have happened, because Jesus clearly said that he would return during the lifetime of his disciples. Here's the problem with that. It's a really poor interpretation for the reasons we talked about before. First of all, context. Matthew 16 is not talking about second coming. Matthew 16, if you read it, that section is not about eschatology. Jesus is not talking about the future. If you read that section of Matthew 16, up to and before verse 18, Jesus is talking about the Christian life. That passage begins with the famous words where Jesus says, if any man come after me, let him take up his cross and follow me. Jesus is talking about the life of the Christian. It's going to be a difficult life. You have to take up your cross and follow me. However, he says you will be rewarded, and I have the authority to reward you. Go, please read it yourself. He says the Christian life will be difficult. I have the authority to reward you. And then he says in Matthew chapter in 16, 18, he says, there are those of you standing here today who will not taste death till they see me coming in his kingdom. Let's look at those words. And in my video on the little season, I actually put the interlinear Bible section on the screen, showing what the interpretation of that word kingdom is. It does not mean his second coming kingdom. That word kingdom is the Greek word basileia. Basileia, it says right there, not a literal kingdom. It means royal authority. And again, I have it on the screen in that video. I even circle it. See, it says not a literal kingdom. Basileia means royal authority. So what Jesus is actually saying is that there are some of you standing here who will live to see me appear in my royal authority. So wrap it up. The Christian life will be difficult. You will be rewarded. I have the authority to give you that reward. And some of you will see me coming and appearing in that authority. Again, the preterists believe that happens 40 years later in 70 AD. And they tease futurists like myself saying, oh, you believe Jesus is still waiting 2,000 years? It only took him 30 years. Actually, preterists, you're wrong. It didn't only take him 40, it took him less than 40 years. It actually took him 6 days. How do I know that? Easy. You know what comes after Matthew chapter 16? Matthew chapter 17. You know what happened in Matthew chapter 17? The transfiguration, where he takes his disciples, a subset of the ones who are standing there, and he is transfigured before them. He appears in his royal authority. So Jesus says, Christian life is going to be hard. I have the authority to give you a reward. Some of you are going to see me standing in my, appearing in my authority. 6 days later, some of them standing there sees Jesus appear in his royal authority, in his transfiguration. Prophecy solved, done, prophecy fulfilled. Not after 40 years or 2,000 years, after 6 days. That's the easy. No, what's Occam's razor? That is the rhetorical idea that the simplest explanation is probably the correct one. If Jesus says, some of you are going to see me in my royal authority, and then 6 days later, some of them see him in his royal authority, isn't that much more simple and direct than trying to wedge all the events of the tribulation into an event 40 years later that doesn't fit it at all? And then trying to wedge the millennial reign of Christ into 1,000 years of erased history? What's easier to understand? What makes more sense? What's simpler? Jesus appeared 6 days later, exactly as he said he would, or all these things happened with no evidence for them. 1,000-year kingdom occurred with no evidence. That an everlasting kingdom happened, but then even though it's everlasting, Jesus left, or he's gone, or he's in a hobbit hole at the North Pole, waiting for Satan to do something that he is showing no signs that he's doing. What makes more sense? That's really the long and short of it.
Yeah.
I mean, you said before, Satan can't win. You're right, he can't win. He knows he can't win. But I think Satan's goal is not to win, as you said. His goal is to see that God loses as much as possible. And what does God want? God wants us all to dwell with him. God wants us all to be with him. So what Satan can say is, well, I may not win, but I can get as many people as possible to be deceived so that they don't join you. And that's why deceptions like this are so dangerous, because this is Satan winning. Not winning per se, but Satan racking up some losses against God. God will not get everything he wants, because God wants every human who's ever been born to be with him. They won't. And Satan says, I want to make things as hard for you as possible. And that's what he does with deceptions. And this is a deception. It doesn't make sense.
Just my final sort of thoughts on it. So, what people need to understand is I've got sort of two things I want to say. So, the occasion of Paul writing to the Thessalonians, it was to correct some errors regarding the end times, and it was some believers had heard false teachers, and among one of these falsehoods was that the day of the Lord has already come. So there we go. That
Yeah.
heresy was going around when Paul the Apostle was walking earth. The second thing I want to say is that this preterism is basically what the little season comes from. Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun, so we need to keep that in mind. This preterism is from the Counter Reformation, and it's a Jesuit heresy. Louis de Alcazar, I don't know if that's his correct name, but he's a Jesuit priest, and he was the prominent preterist expositor of prophecy, and it's a Roman Catholic Jesuit heresy. So for all you guys out there who are Protestants and are believing in the little season, you need to understand that its roots are from a Jesuit priest. It's nothing new under the sun. It's just an old heresy that's been repackaged to deceive people, and it's now become popular online. And there's guys out there making a living off this now. And I think we've said all we need to say, Ed. I mean, it's been fascinating talking to you. We've
Well, can I
covered,
just
yeah.
go real quick? I just want to back up something you just said. And the reason, so why would this be something that is proposed, that is advocated and promulgated by the Catholic hierarchy. Keep in mind what that they are the most, as a group, they are the most amillennial. And by amillennial, I mean people who do not advocate an actual millennial. Why? Because the idea, as my old mentor Chuck Mister would say, the idea of Jesus coming down and overturning the evil rulers of the world wouldn't be very popular with the evil rulers of the world. And Catholicism has ruled the world for a long time, even to this day, not as overtly as they did during medieval periods and since then, but through banking and through all their other uh, um, proxies, they still rule the world. So the idea of Jesus coming and his kingdom is not something that they want people looking forward to. So it will make sense to them to say, hey, it's not coming. Don't look forward to it. Either it doesn't exist or it's already happened. And if it's already happened, we're now looking for it. And I think that's really important for people to keep in mind. Just piggybacking on what you just said, because I thought what you said was really important. Understanding the origin of these things and the motivation for why people would not want us to believe that we have any place in the future in the coming kingdom of Christ, because they want their kingdom to last forever, not Christ.
If people thought the Roman Empire had disappeared, it hasn't. It's just morphed into the Vatican. If people think the British Empire has disappeared, think again. The City of London, the square mile, the most powerful square mile on earth, all the money runs through there. Three cities, Washington, D.C., the Vatican, and the City of London rule the world. Them three cities, empires don't disappear, they just change into something else. Just
Right.
like these old heresies, they morph into something, they repackage, just as, like this little season is
The
preterism
Vatican, yeah,
repackaged.
yeah. The Vatican is the religious center. London is the
Yeah,
financial center, and DC is a military center.
that's right. Absolutely, 100%. And if that sounds a bit bizarre to some people, I'm surprised if a lot of my listeners won't have heard this. I would imagine most of them have, but if you haven't, look into it. Empire of the City, Vatican, City of London, Washington, D.C. Ed, it's been fantastic talking to you. So just
Same.
before we go, just remind people where they can connect with you and just tell people what you're up to.
Absolutely. So the best place to reach me is faithbyreason.net, not .com, .net. There you will find hundreds of hours of the things I've put up, blogs, podcasts, videos. I'm starting a Patreon pretty soon that's going to take even deeper dives into things like this. I mostly do verse by verse studies and fundamentals of the Christian faith. But in my Patreon, there's going to be bonus content that's going to talk about things like this and things that are even more esoteric. And there's also going to be a monthly live Bible study where we go through the entire Bible in a year in just an hour a month. And something people have been asking me for. It'll be a live thing, and it'll be so you'll be able to get that if you're one of my Patreon. So just look forward to that on Faith by Reason.
Oh, brilliant stuff. Thanks, Ed. So, guys, you've
Thank
heard,
you.
what Ed's had to say there, and I've chipped in a little bit regarding this little season. Like I said, we've talked about it before on here, but I just wanted to bring Ed on because we're a little bit concerned how much traction this thing's getting. And like I've said before, this podcast is about getting to the truth. So, thanks again, Ed.